Fellas, this has been a long time coming. Ignition damage clarification. Now, I know some of you are like, Cross, all I care about is more kabloomies. Why do I need clarification on those kabloomies? Well, let me just say, your ignition damage could be greatly suffering from a number of factors. I'm talking about your damage being cut down 50% or more. And this is huge considering that this season we have solar weapons with our artifact mods that are so good. Things from Sunshot to Dragon's Breath, Polaris Lance, and even Tommy's Matchbook. And no lie, guys, these solar weapons feel amazing. Partly due to the fact that we have Solar Surge all season, but most notably because of the insane artifact mods that we have in our arsenal. But one mistake we made in our Tommy's Matchbook video was about ignition damage. You see, guys, ignition damage is just flat out broken. And not broken as if they're doing an insane amount of extra damage that they're not supposed to be doing, but broken in the sense that sometimes they are doing way, and I mean way less damage than intended, which was part of the mistake we made in our Tommy's Matchbook review. I want to start by covering what ignition actually is, for those of you that may not know. An ignition is a solar verb, which reads, a large solar explosion that deals damage in an area around the target and stuns unstoppable champions. Now, ignitions can be triggered by applying 100 Scorch to an enemy, which this season is easier to do than ever. We have fragments like Ember of Ashes, which applies more Scorch stacks to targets. Ember of Combustion, where Final Blows with a solar super causes targets to ignite and create a fire sprite. Ember of Char, where solar ignitions will spread Scorch to affected targets. We have aspects like Gunpowder Gamma, Soul Invictus, Consecration, that all cause ignitions, Scorch, or at least lean into that effect. Majority of our supers, melees, and grenade abilities that cause Scorch damage can help lead to those ignitions. Then we have tons of solar exotics that also do Scorch and ignitions intrinsically. But this, of course, leads to our artifact mods, which is where the problem starts. It turns out that our anti-champion effects is the root of these problems. It is the thing that is messing with our ignition damage. Anti-barrier, unstoppable, overload, even radiant, which gives us anti-barrier capabilities, is causing these conflicts. Let me just give you an example. Here at Carl, our ignition damage is dealing 42,717 damage, and this is consistently pretty much across the board. We're getting this with Polaris Lance, Tommy's Matchbook, Skyburner's Oath, Dragon's Breath, as well as incandescent weapons followed up with Knife Trick. Now, when we slap on our artifact mod, Overload Auto Rifle, this does funky stuff. Notice our Tommy's Matchbook ignition damage goes down to a whopping 17,087 damage. Now, if we proc Radiant, it's a little bit higher, cranking it up to 21,359. But obviously, this is still way lower than it should be. We're talking 50 to 60% decrease in damage simply for having on an artifact mod, which is what we're supposed to be doing when dealing with champions. And this is exactly why we thought Tommy's Matchbook received some sort of stealth buff. If we look back at our pre and post testing for Season 21 and Season 22, we can see Tommy's Matchbook ignition damage doing 17,087 damage because we had, unfortunately, anti-champion mods equipped. At the time, we never heard of this issue. We didn't even think of testing this. Never would we have expected that a simple artifact mod would be messing with our ignition damage, which is why at the beginning of the season when we tested this, before we had artifact mods unlocked, we were doing the max of that 42,717 ignition damage. Now, why is this happening? It seems kind of random for our anti-champion effects to be lowering ignition damage. Well, that's why we're making this video, because Bungie, you need to fix this. Thankfully, it was the post here from Mr. Rock DC that brought our attention to this problem. This was community research that was shared with us, but at base, an ignition deals 250 damage. It then gets given a universal 3-time multiplier, and then gets put through Bungie's various different power scalers and combatant scalers, which is why, to be consistent, we are doing all of our testing on Carl, giving us that 42,717 ignition damage, as different enemies in different places may have different scaling. Now, we of course also have subclass verbs that inflict anti-champion effects, such as Radiant, which can stun barrier champions. Bungie coded these effects in a very particular way so that we wouldn't overlap them, as they don't want a single weapon or ability to apply multiple effects. Now, obviously, there are some exceptions, such as Chill Clip, which can stun both Overload and Unstoppable champions, but if we take Tommy's Matchbook, for instance, its ignitions can stun Unstoppable champions. However, if you have Overload Auto Rifles equipped, Tommy's Matchbook on its own won't be able to stun Unstoppable champions. The only way around this is if you start to Scorch from a different source, which is really the core issue here. For whatever reason, in Bungie's spaghetti code, when these anti-champion effects are being procced, our ignition damage does not appear to be going through that 3-time multiplier, but instead through the weapons multiplier, which is typically significantly lower than an ignition 3-time multiplier, which is why the damage can end up being so much lower. Here's some examples that may help you understand this better though. Base Tommy's Matchbook causes an ignition damage, dealing 42,717 damage. Tommy's Tommy's Matchbook with Overload Auto Rifle equipped, we're dealing 17,087 ignition damage. Tommy's Matchbook with Radiant being procced deals 21,359 ignition damage, which is that 25% increase over our previous 17,000 number, that being due to Radiant. Now, if we take Tommy's Matchbook with Kindling Trigger artifact mod equipped, which reads that Radiant causes solar weapons to apply Scorch to unscorched combatants, we proc Radiant, shoot Carl with Tommy's Matchbook, which applies Scorch first from our artifact mod, then the rest through Tommy's exotic perk, and we still arrive at 42,717 damage because Kindling Trigger is our first source of Scorch, and it is not affected by anti-champion capabilities. Now, in an ideal world, this should be higher since we have Radiant procced, but 42,000 is much better than 17,000. Now, here's another example. We have the Flint Striker artifact mod equipped, which reads that rapid solar weapon precision hits and rapid solar weapon final blows grant Radiant. Now, if we use this to give ourselves Radiant before trying to activate an ignition with Tommy's Matchbook, look at this, guys. We're going to be dealing 21,359 damage. However, if Flint Striker activates after we've already caused that initial Scorch with Tommy, this gives us Radiant afterwards and ends up buffing our ignition damage by 25%, now giving us 53,397 damage. And again, this is because Radiant is procced after our initial Scorch is being dealt. Now, some other things we noted in our testing is that Radiant and Overload rocket launchers actually buffs Dragon's Breath. At the base, of course, its ignition damage is 42,717 damage. With Overload rocket launcher equipped, get this, guys, it brings our ignition damage up to 66,924. And with Radiant equipped, this brings our ignition damage up to 83,654. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't seem like Overload rockets and Radiant stacked together, as it was giving us the same 83,654. But since rockets have a higher multiplier than that 3-time ignition multiplier, when using an anti-champion effect, this will up the damage instead of lowering it like on our other weapons. TLDR, guys, always, and I mean always, be using Overload rockets. Now, another thing to note is that the ignition from Raise to Precision does not get lowered either. This artifact mod reads that while Radiant, solar precision final blows cause combatants to ignite. Now, considering you need to be Radiant for these ignitions to occur, that would be pretty unfortunate, but it is dealing the same base 42,000 damage. And even getting a kill with Tommy and Overload auto rifle equipped, it's still giving us 42,000 ignition damage. Across all of that being said, what does this mean? What are we supposed to do with this information? Are you really asking us not to use anti-champion mods and not to use Radiant with certain weapons? No, not necessarily. What I'm really asking for is Bungie to come out here and fix this, is what I'm really asking for, considering we have nearly 4 months left of this season. At the same time, I'm hoping to inform you the way we were informed from this amazing Reddit post. You need to be wary of the things that will give you anti-champion effects if you're looking to maximize the amount of damage your ignitions are doing. If you're bringing Tommy into a GM and trying to use ignitions to stun and stop with champions, but you have Overload auto rifle equipped, you're not only going to be doing a hell of a lot less damage, but it's also not going to be stunning the champion due to your Overload mod taking priority. Something I know most of you know, but the big takeaway is that ignition damage will scale down. Now, you can get around this by starting your Scorch source another way when using Tommy or other weapons. Now, you also want to keep in mind things like Well of Radiance and Ember of Torches, which can have fairly high uptime with Radiant, which is going to lower your ignition damage unless you start Scorching before proccing Radiant. And again, that's with another source. As mentioned, you can also make sure you're using Kindling Trigger, as that will always be your initial source of Scorch when Radiant. Listen to me, fellas. Use this artifact mod. It is the one saving grace here in working around all this spaghetti code. So that's it, guys. I just wanted to clear things up. We had some misconceptions in our Tommy's Matchbook video. We literally were like, oh my god, it got a stealth buff, but that's not the case. In the meantime, be conscious of your build, how you're applying Scorch, use Overload Rocket with Dragon's Breath, and for the love of God, Bungie, please get this fixed. Well, fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
slap that like button like your mama told you right.